Welcome back, everyone. Today we're making a cinch backpack. And the finished bag measures in at 15 by 18, and you can collapse this down into a smaller pocket that measures in at 9.5 by 7 inches. And if you use the right materials in your project, this is a super awesome all-around gym bag, giving you pockets for your shoes, extra hooks, water bottle holders, and a ton of room in the main pocket to pack all your gym essentials. But other than that, this project is super easy for all skill levels. If you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the detailed step-by-step tutorial. And with that being said, if you are new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're going to want to grab 1 1/4 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a nylon or any lightweight water resistant fabric. If you're going to be using this bag for a gym bag or anything along those lines, you're going to want your fabric to be a little bit resistant to water. I'm going to be using a nylon fabric and a few other fabrics, but the nylon fabric is going to be the main fabric for the inside. But like always, any fabric will work with this bag, so use whatever fabric that's really going to pull out your design. You'll need a 1/4 yard of mesh fabric, and this is going to be for the water bottle pockets up front. You'll need 2 yards of rope, and I recommend somewhere in the 8mm range. I'm going to be using 8mm on this bag. I found that was a real nice size rope and it felt good on my shoulders. Going along with that rope, you'll need 2 eyelets. I'm going to be using 5/16 eyelets. This was a perfect size for the 8mm rope. And keep in mind, if you do get bigger rope, you're going to want to make sure your rope fits through your eyelets, so you're going to have to adjust that accordingly. You'll need a 1/4 yard of 1-inch webbing, and this is going to be for the handles up top and the loops up front. So it is totally optional. If you don't want to add the webbing, you don't have to. You'll need a 1/4 yard of elastic band. I recommend going at least a 1/2 inch to 1 inch. We're going to be folding this over the raw edge on the water bottle pocket, so you're going to want it wide enough to fold over that edge. You'll need 4 separate zippers ranging from 8 inches to 19 inches. I'm going to be cutting mine off a roll. I found this was a great way to do it. It saves you a ton of money with minimal waste. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super simple to use. All you have to do is print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you tape it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And once you have your pattern printed out and your supplies gathered, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best possible results. And from here, cut on the outside of the black line. After cutting, you should end up with 4 center zipper end panels cut out of your main fabric, 4 top zipper end panels cut out of your main fabric, 1 inside pocket top panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold, 1 inside pocket bottom panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold, 1 front top middle panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold, 2 rope loop panels cut out of your main fabric on the fold, 2 front bottom side mesh panels cut out of your mesh material, but if you're not using a mesh material, just cut them out of your main fabric. 1 front bottom middle panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 inside bottom lining panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold, 1 main back panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold. And when it comes to these bigger pattern pieces, you don't necessarily have to cut them on the fold. You can place the pattern on your fabric and just reflect the pattern piece. This is going to give you the same results and maybe save a little bit of fabric. 1 inside top lining panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold. And the same goes for this bigger panel. You can just reflect it or you can cut it on the fold. 1 front bottom panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold. And lastly, 1 front top panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold. Moving on to construction, start by grabbing your front bottom side mesh panels. And we're going to be adding elastic to the top edge, so find your top edge, grab your elastic. We're going to be using a 1-inch elastic. I like to cut mine about 1 inch shorter than the actual width of the panel. This is going to allow the elastic to pull and cinch back and hold your water bottle into position. And then we're going to fold the elastic over the raw edge, making sure there's even elastic on both sides of the panel. And the trick is to pull the elastic to the width of the panel as you're sewing. It's also best to sew as close as you can to the elastic edge, so that way you get the most fabric within that stitch. And as you can see, that elastic is pulling back to its initial size, and that's what we're looking for. Next, grab your front and bottom middle panel. Using the pattern we're going to find and mark the center. And we're going to be adding a strip of webbing to that center. Before we add the webbing, I like to split it into quarters, and an easy way to do that is fold it in half, make a mark, and then fold those halves in half. With our webbing quartered, we're going to place it directly in the center of our middle panel. Pin the webbing down, and we're going to be adding tack stitches to each one of those marks. And I'm going back and forth quite a few times to really make these loops strong. And this step can be skipped if you don't feel like adding this feature. Moving on, grab your front bottom side panels, lay them with the right sides pointing up, and we're going to place the mesh pocket panels on the bottom half of these side panels. And to get the tops lined up, we're going to have to stretch that elastic to the size of the side panel. Line up both of the side panels with the correct side on the middle panel, and we're going to place the right sides together, sandwiching the mesh pocket in between the side panel and the middle panel. From here, we're going to stitch both sides at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's best to use pins so that way the mesh pocket doesn't slide around as you're sewing. Flip the assembly to the wrong side, and typically we would add a top stitch. But we're first going to clean up that raw edge by adding double fold bias tape, and I'm going to run you through a few different methods. The first method is using a bias tape making kit, and this is where you make your own bias tape. It's super simple to do. You cut your bias tape strips, feed it through your folder, and press it as it's coming out your folder. And by picking this method, you get to choose the size and also the color of fabric to match your project. The second method is using a double fold bias tape binder. You install this to your machine, and it gives you the ability to sew directly onto your garment. It's a very fast and effective technique. The third technique is using pre-made bias tape. This technique, you're very limited to colors, but it's easy to do. You just fold it over your edge and stitch it down. This is a great way to go if you don't have a lot of tools to work with. And I'm going to be stitching mine on using the double fold bias tape attachment. By far, this is one of the best techniques if you're planning on making a lot of bags, but feel free to use whatever method that works best for you. And after adding the bias tape, we're going to flip it back to the right side, point a seam allowance towards the middle panel, and we're going to add a top stitch to both of those seams. And I'm using an edge presser foot. It helps me get a nice consistent straight stitch all the way down that seam. After finishing up the top stitch, we're going to grab our front bottom panel, line the curved edge up with the curved edge of our complete assembly, place the right sides together. Since we're working with a curved edge, it's best to pin it into position. Once you have it pinned up and centered, you're going to want to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, we're going to flip the panel flat to double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together and the curve is looking good. From here, we're going to add bias tape to that raw edge. And the bias tape is optional for all these steps, but it really makes for a professional bag. Flip it around to the right side, fold the seam allowance towards the bottom panel, and add a top stitch. Another quick tip is to match the thread color with your fabric color. This helps hide any imperfections within the stitch. Do one last check to make sure all the layers are looking good, and you can place this panel off to the side. Grab your center zipper end panels, cut your zipper to exactly 14 inches, and we're going to sandwich the zipper in between the end panels with right sides together. Once you have the panels perfectly lined up, we're going to stitch both sides at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the wrong sides together and add a top stitch. Do the same thing for the opposite side. With both of the center end panels sewn on, we're going to grab our complete front, line the longer edge up of the zipper with the top edge of our front panel, place the right sides together, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just like previous steps, we're going to add bias tape to that raw edge. After adding bias tape, we're going to flip the right side of the zipper up, move the seam allowance towards the bottom of the panel, and add a top stitch. Since I have two different color fabrics on my front, I actually skipped the middle panel and just top stitched the side panels. I then went back and top stitched that center panel with the correct thread color. After finishing up the top stitch, grab your inside bottom lining panel, flip the panel open with right sides pointing up, find the zipper edge, and that's going to be at the top of your panel. Place the complete front assembly on top, lining up the zipper, grab the front top middle panel, and line the flat edge up on the opposite side of the zipper with right sides together. Make sure all the layers are lined up and centered, and since we're working with multiple layers, add a few pins and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And after completing the stitch, flip the panels open, double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together. If everything's looking good, we're going to add bias tape to that raw edge. After adding bias tape, we're going to flip the top panel open, leaving the lining down, fold the seam allowance up towards the top panel, and add a top stitch. This one's going to be on the front and center of your bag, so you really want it to look nice. And you want to double check to make sure all the edges line up correctly. Place the panel off to the side and grab your top zipper end panels. Cut your zipper to exactly 18 inches, and we're going to do the same thing we did with the other zipper. We're going to sandwich the zipper in between the end panels with the right sides of the end panels together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the wrong sides together and add a top stitch to both of the ends. After completing the zipper assembly, we're going to grab our complete front and add it to the curved edge at the top. Just like before, we're going to line the longer end of the zipper up with the curved edge, and the best way to do it is to line up the center on both of the zipper and the panel, pin everything into place, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If done correctly, both zipper end panels should overlap. By this point, you should know the next step. We're going to add bias tape to that raw edge. This one I left the ends on because actually what you want to do is snip everything flush on the side. So if those end panels went over just a little bit, snip it flush. With everything trimmed up, we're going to fold the seam allowance towards the bottom and add a top stitch. This is another top stitch that's right out there in front, so you want to take your time to make sure it's nice and neat. Next, we're going to grab the inside pocket bottom panel, unfold the panel and find the zipper edge. Cut your zipper to just go past the outside edges of the panel, place the right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the right side of the zipper open, and before we add bias tape or top stitch, we're actually going to be adding the opposite side. So grab your inside pocket top panel, place it on the opposite side of the zipper with right sides together, making sure it lines up with the bottom panel, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open up the panel and flip it around to the wrong side. From here, we're going to bias tape both of these raw edges. And this is just a quicker technique, so you're not running back and forth from bias taping to stitching. You're going to want to fold the seam allowance in opposite directions and add a top stitch to both sides. And you really want this bag to look nice inside and out because this is the bag you're going to be collapsing the bigger bag down into. Fold the complete assembly in half, lining up the bottom panel with the top panel. And we're just going to stitch the side edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Leave the top edge open. We're going to be sewing the top edge into a hem, so we don't need to add a stitch. Next, you can trim the zipper ends flush with the seam allowance. And the last step to complete our pocket is add bias tape on both of our side edges. And feel free to change the dimensions of this bag if you want a bigger inside pocket. And you can go ahead and place this panel off to the side and grab our front top panel and our main back panel. We're going to start by marking all of the hem guides on both of the panels. And we're doing this part together so that way we get them both lined up with one another. The first step in the hemming process is just to snip the bottom side hem. And only snip it a 1/2 inch into the panel. With it snipped, it's going to allow us to roll that edge over twice, a 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch, making it a nice clean edge. Add a few pins, and we're going to repeat this process for all of the other side hems. And this step can be pretty tedious because you want all those side hems to line up perfectly with one another. And once you have them all lined up and pinned down, we're going to stitch directly in the center of that hem on the right side of the fabric. Check to make sure both sides line up evenly, and from here we're going to focus on the front top panel. So we're going to start by just folding the top hem and then bringing that top hem down to the bottom marking. Pin it down, and we're going to use the pattern to help place the webbing handle. Slide the webbing into the hemmed area, add a few pins. And the key thing to note here is to make sure that top edge is perfectly straight. If it's looking straight, then we're going to go ahead and add a top stitch. And I highly recommend matching the thread color to your fabric for the best look. From here, we're going to repeat the exact same thing for the main back panel. Fold the top hem and line it perfectly up with the bottom hem. We will be adding one more step, and that's going to be adding the pocket into that hem. And this is done by centering the pocket within the panel and sliding that top edge into the hem about a 1/4 inch. And lastly, we're going to use the pattern to place our webbing. You want to make sure you place it the same width as the previous webbing. With everything lined up and pinned down, we're going to add a top stitch all the way along that hem. It can get pretty bulky going over the pocket, so just take your time. Make sure the top edge lines up exactly with the opposite panel, and from here we're going to grab the inside top lining panel. Flip it open with right sides pointing up, and we're going to place our complete assembly directly on top, lining the top curved edge up. Grab the complete front top panel, place the right sides together, and line both of the curved edges up. And this is easily done by marking the centers and working towards the outsides. From here, we're going to pin it down and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And after finishing up the stitch, we're going to open up the panel and flip it around to the back side. From here, we're going to add bias tape to that raw edge. With the bias tape on, we're going to flip it back to the right side, fold the seam allowance towards the top edge, and add a top stitch. Working with these curves can be a little bit tricky, so if it's not coming out right the first try, just dethread it and try it again. It may take a few tries to get it perfect. And these top stitches are optional, so you can go ahead and skip ahead if you don't like the look. Moving on, grab your rope loop panels. With the wrong sides pointed up, we're going to chalk out the seam allowance on the bottom edge, fold directly on your marking. Make sure both panels are even, and from here we're going to fold it in half. Add a pin and repeat this process for the opposite panel. Stitch all the way around the outside edge as close as you can to the edge. Feel free to add a couple more stitches for extra strength. Repeat this process for the opposite panel. Next, we're going to grab our eyelets. You only need 2 eyelets, 1 per panel. I'm using 5/16 eyelets. We're going to place them directly in the center of the panel. I like to cut out an X for these bigger size eyelets. Place the eyelets in your opening, slide the backs on, and I'm using a hammer die. To set the eyelets, feel free to use a hammer die, a die press, or even pliers. And when it comes to the size of the eyelet, the biggest thing you want to make sure is that the rope can fit through your eyelet. So if you choose to scale up the size of the rope, just make sure you scale up the size of the eyelet. Grab your complete main back panel, make sure the right side's pointing up, and we're going to place them on the bottom edge about 1.5 inches away from the bottom, perfectly lined up with one another, and stitch as close as you can to the outside edge. Next, we're going to grab the complete front panel and place it directly on top with right sides together, making sure the top edge perfectly lines up, same as the bottom edge. And if the bottom edge for some reason doesn't line up, there's a lot of moving parts here and a lot of seam allowances, you can always just trim the bottom edges up perfectly flush, essentially creating a new bottom edge. But if you've done everything correctly, it should all line up perfectly. You will have to pull out the side pockets when you're sewing, but pin everything together and stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You're going to want to start stitching directly at your side hem. And if you did use elastic on the mesh pockets, you really want to make sure that you pull it out as you're getting near the pocket so that way you don't miss it. And after completing the stitch, you definitely want to make sure all the layers got sewn together. Flip the right side out, just double check everything, and from here we're going to add bias tape all the way around that outside edge. I really think the bias tape goes a long ways on this project. It's really going to pop those bottom corners out and make for a longer lasting bag. So flip the right sides out, and our last step is adding our rope. And we are cutting our rope fairly big. We're cutting 2 2-yard strips. Starting with the first strip, we're going to feed it through our front panel hem. Pull the rope to make sure you have even proportions on both sides, and then feed it through your eyelet from front to back. Grab your second rope strip, feed it through the same hem on the front panel. Make sure it's even on both sides, and from here it's going to get a little bit different. Each end we're going to feed back through the opposite side on the back hem. So the right will feed back through the right and go to the left, and the left will feed back through the left and go to the right. Make sure both strips are even on both sides. And the simplest way to do this is just tie a knot. Bring the right ends together and tie a knot, and then do the same thing for both of the left ends. And if done correctly, you should be able to cinch the top closed. And the final step is adding your branding or some sort of logo. And the reason we left that inside pocket inside out is that way we can flip the entire bag inside out through that inside pocket, collapsing the entire bag down into a smaller bag for travel. And there you have it, your cinch backpack is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. I hope this project came together really easy for you and yours look super good. And if it doesn't look good the first time, definitely practice it a few times. This is a little tricky with that front panel. You're layering a lot of pockets together, and trying to get those all precisely lined up with the correct seam allowance can be a little bit tricky. But like anything, practice really will take your bags to that next level. And pretty much anything in sewing, any project you do in sewing, the more you do that specific project, the better you will get. But anyways, like always, comment down below if you have any questions. I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.